The theologians that stood out the most to me during this course were Amos Young, John Swinton, and Howard Voss, whatever how you say his name, and Vanier. I liked Amos Young because he gave me a different framing for looking at biblical narratives. I liked John Swinton and Vanier because they gave me the practicality of how to live out disability theology. And I enjoyed Howard Voss because he gave me a way to be aware of the philosophy that's going on in the world and how that affects my thinking. What about you, James?
Well, my list was pretty similar. I enjoyed Amos Young, John Swinton, and Vanier, as well as, I was challenged by Nancy Iseland. So Nancy Iseland was the first introduction into the idea of disability theology for me, and it was less of a formative thing and more of just a challenge to think about the topic. Amos Young really challenged my faith, and I think deepened it in a lot of ways by having me reevaluate biblical narratives. And then I agree with you as well that John Swinton and Vanier gave very practical thoughts on how to approach disability theology in a way that's not just motivated by pity or my own discomfort, but in a way to really create community through friendship.
Yeah. Another guy who helped me with my thinking was C.S. Lewis and his thoughts on pain. Just kind of looking deeper into pain and how it can shape a life and what to do with it really gave me insight into disability and how to kind of look at it through the Christian life.
Yeah, I actually also read The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis and brought a quote I wanted to share really quick. It says, "Mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, but it is more common and also more hard to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases the burden. It is easier to say my tooth is aching than to say my heart is broken."
Wow, so deep. So 3 verses that have been influential in my disability theology. One is Job, chapter 40, where God talks to Job about how awesome he is. Psalm 139 verse 14, and John chapter 13 verses 1 through 17, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. I mainly want to just focus on Psalm 139 again, how the Longman commentary says that God basically intimately knows his creation and he has a reason for it. So that influences my practice and my view of people with disabilities or just anyone by knowing that God has touched them and that they are created by him, meant to have dignity because of him and meant to be loved because of him.
Thanks, Elon. So 3 verses that influenced my disability theology were the naming of Jacob into Israel. That was Genesis 32:28. And the original Genesis 1:27 verse of man and woman being created in the image of God. That was pretty foundational. And then the last one was Exodus chapter 4 verse 11. This is the argument that Moses is having with God, where God says, who makes man's mouth? The Hamilton commentary says that if Moses is a poor communicator, then it's because God made him that way. And it mentions that God never healed Moses of his speech impediment. And that it was a pretty challenging verse for me as I considered it, just that we like to think of the world as healing always being the will of God, but God doesn't seem to view disability that way, and healing doesn't seem to always be his will for this lifetime. And so that was just something that I thought about a lot about in my time
So if I were to summarize my practice as an SLP in 2 words, it would be humility and the Hebrew word hesed. Humility is basically taking into account the Bible verses and the thinking of the different theologians, where you're close to the ground and you're always working with the people who are presented to you, whether it's a client or a parent or a doctor. And I want to always be humble, keep my wonder and dignity for the client and the doctor or whoever I'm interacting with, and always having listening ears. And the Hebrew word hesed means a rugged love, where my love for God keeps me going in loving others, and kind of always realizing that God is writing a story, no matter how dark it may seem.
I really like those points, Elon. I think for my practice as an SLP, the things that I'm looking to keep in mind are to approach people with disabilities with an open heart, just not to let my discomfort get in the way of ministering to them and also receiving from them. I think one of the impactful points was that people with disabilities are able to, they have a lot to offer and a lot to give, and that relating to them in a way that is meaningful and intentional is going to be a very important aspect of my future practice. Also, just to realize that just to be active about encouraging them in the idea of God's creation of them as like in His image.
Now we're going to talk about whether our views have changed from the beginning till now. And I would say yes, my views of disability and theology have changed. I've become more informed, and after looking at my quick write, I realized that I didn't really have a space in my thinking for giving agency to those with disabilities. But through Vanier and John Swinton and Johnny and Friends, I realized that everyone has a piece to give. It's whether you make the space for that or not. And I also am convicted to always ask God for a right view of difference, that sometimes you shouldn't divide, other times you do divide, but do it with grace and do it with wisdom in a way that creates more ability for everyone all the way around, from yourself to your clients. What about you?
Well, I would also say that my views have definitely changed. A lot of the foundational views hadn't really changed because I did grow up around a lot of people with disabilities and had a lot of conversations growing up with my parents and grandparents about it. So a lot of those views did not change, but I am realizing that I'm asking a lot of new questions and deeper questions around just the theological aspect and how I approach people with disabilities in my life and in my practice as an SLP. I would say that Amos Young was really, really foundational in that, just looking at new narratives and challenging a deeper look at my faith.
Thanks, guys, for looking at our video. As always, greetings from the North Pole. Have a great break.